Hey everyone, this is Miss Moriarty, and I'm here to discuss with us our now new Unit 6, which is all about energy resources and consumption. In this video, I'm going to talk about topic 6.1, which is all about renewable versus non renewable resources, and topic 6.2, which is looking at the global energy consumption. Now, we talked a little bit about this today in class with our discussion on what makes something renewable versus non renewable. We know that a renewable energy source is something that has a fixed amount, um, tends to involve some sort of energy transformation, and in doing so is not easily replaced, right? We know that things like coal, oil, natural gas, those are types of fossil fuels that can take up to millions of years in order to form underground. Uranium, which is the fuel type used in nuclear power, is very similar in that it is found underground and can take very long periods of time for it to form versus renewable energy resources. Those are ones that tend to be replenished naturally at or near the rate at which that population is consuming them. And oftentimes they can be reused. What falls under that category are things like biomass. So that would be something like ethanol we talked about today in class, as well as, say, like wood. Those would be classified as biomass. We know solar, wind, geothermal, which is using the heat from Earth's core, hydroelectric power, and a hydrogen fuel cell are all examples of renewable resources. Now, what's the key to ensuring that that renewable energy stays renewable? We need to ensure that the rate at which we are using it is either at or below its rate of regeneration. The reason why the use of fossil fuels and the reserves that we have left is now becoming a growing issue is because the more and more we use them, the more and more we're going to run out of them much faster, and it's going to take far too long for them to regenerate for us to continue using them at the rate in which we are. Now, looking at topic 6.2, right, with that same discussion of renewable versus non renewable, looking at how people on Earth tend to use those fuel types to provide energy is a key piece in trying to become more sustainable and ensuring that everybody has the appropriate amount of energy to survive. Now, the use of those energy resources we know are not evenly distributed between developed and developing countries. But we do know that looking at fuel types, we tend to see a pattern of fossil fuels being used the most. Thinking back to Unit 3, we know that developing countries are going to go through a demographic transition and eventually become more developed. And in doing so, we tend to see a greater reliance on fossil fuels because now demand for energy is going to continue to increase. Now, that also means that the availability, price, and maybe governmental regulation influencing any of those energy resources may also have another influence on how and when and what gets used. Now, looking at the difference between energy usage of a developing versus a developed country, we can actually see developed nations tend to use more energy on a per capita basis or per person basis versus a developing nation, which tends to use more energy in total, because we know that we're going to continue to see that developing nation's population rise. Now, this kind of goes back to like talking about our eco footprints. We know that our the energy in which you use and your resources that you tend to use are going to correlate to the amount of energy that you need and amount of resources that you need. U.S. Resident tends to use about 5 times as much energy as the world average. And it's important to note that as those developing countries become closer and closer to, say, a developed nation like the US, we start to see that per capita energy usage increase. So you can kind of see that in this graph here, the correlation between the GDP per capita or the gross domestic product per capita versus the energy use, right? You can see up at the top there, lots of very developed nations tend to use more energy per capita than, say, our far less GDP per capita nations. Now, in looking at how those developed versus developing nations use their energy, prior to a developing nation becoming far more developed, they usually rely mainly on what's called subsistence fuels. So they're actually more reliant on things like biomass. So those would be things like wood or charcoal, maybe even dried animal manure, usually items that they can actually find in their local area. It isn't until that nation continues to develop more and become more industrialized do we see a greater increase in economic development, greater affluence or wealth, increase that GDP. And that's where the greater reliance on fossil fuels and a greater energy demand needs to be met. Now, we know it's troubling when we see that around the globe, energy usage and the need for more energy is only going to increase. And so the fact that fossil fuels, our oil, coal, and natural gas are the ones that we rely on the most, we may need to change that up. We may need to enforce different types of regulations and cut back on the amount of fossil fuels that we might use to ensure that we have enough energy for the future. Now, what are some of these fuel types used for? We know that petroleum, oil, most commonly used right in the form of gasoline, is our main fuel to power our vehicles, right? It's how we get around. Coal's main purpose is to fuel for electricity generation. So that would be turning the lights on at home, making sure that your home is heated. Natural gas can also do something very similar. It's usually a secondary fuel that people tend to use for electricity generation and heating your home. Now, another type of fuel source, besides fossil fuels being the most prevalent, second to that is actually hydroelectric energy. And I know when we were looking at our energy usage activity, a lot of the states that people chose actually had a lot of hydroelectric energy. That tends to be electricity driven from the movement of water, usually behind maybe some sort of dam. Now, the third largest source of energy is actually nuclear. A couple of states in the US still tend to use nuclear power for at least 30 to maybe even 40% of their fuel type. What is nuclear power? It's usually the fission or breaking apart of atoms of uranium to release large amounts of heat to then turn water into steam, turn a turbine, and eventually generate electricity. All right, guys, that is it for our video on 6.1 and 6.2. You want to make sure that as you watch this video, you took notes. You can mark this as done on Classroom. And don't forget to finish your energy usage article analysis for Tuesday.